He assumed she was just another black woman he could intimidate, until she stepped into the courtroom and dismantled his career. The road was nearly deserted that night, with only a few cars passing by, their headlights reflecting off the damp pavement. Streetlights flickered, casting elongated shadows across the highway just outside Birmingham, Alabama. It was late, a little past 11, the kind of hour when most people just wanted to get home. Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson had been driving for nearly 2 hours, absent-mindedly drumming her fingers against the steering wheel while humming along to a soft jazz tune playing through the speakers. She was out of uniform, dressed in a simple black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back. Nothing about her stood out, or so she thought. Then, in her rearview mirror, she spotted flashing red and blue lights rapidly closing in. Her stomach tightened, not out of fear, but sheer exhaustion. She knew exactly how these situations played out. With a steady hand, she signaled, switched lanes, and eased onto the shoulder. After shifting into park, she took a slow breath and kept both hands visible. Years in the military had taught her the protocol. A white patrol car came to a stop behind her. The officer inside took his time getting out. When he finally did, he moved with the air of someone who expected unquestioning obedience, his heavy boots scraping against the asphalt, one hand resting on his belt, the other gripping a flashlight that flicked on as he approached. Renee turned slightly, watching him through the side mirror. The name on his badge glinted in the light. Briggs. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation. His voice was flat, practiced, impatient. Renee met his gaze in the mirror before slowly reaching into the glove compartment and retrieving her documents. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her tone even. Briggs didn't respond right away. He took the papers from her, holding them just out of reach as he gave her a once-over. "Taillights out," he said. She frowned. That can't be right. Briggs finally looked her in the eye. "Are you arguing with me?" A tense silence followed. Renee could feel the shift in the air, that subtle, unspoken moment where power clashed with resistance, where one side expected the other to yield. She had seen it before, during military briefings, in training sessions designed to prepare sailors for life beyond the Navy. She knew better than to push, but she also knew her rights. "I'm just saying," she replied calmly. "My taillights were checked a few weeks ago. But if there's an issue, I'll get it fixed." "Step out of the car," Briggs interrupted, as if he hadn't heard a word she said. Renee exhaled slowly. She glanced at the road ahead. No witnesses. Tapping her fingers against the wheel once, she reached for the door handle. "Mind telling me why?" Briggs tilted his head, smirking. "Because I said so." She let his words hang in the air for a moment, then unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open. The night air was cooler than she expected. Stepping onto the pavement, she remained relaxed yet composed, not seeking confrontation, but unwilling to be intimidated. Briggs took a step back, scanning her. She could feel him assessing her, gauging how much he could get away with. "Turn around. Hands on the car." She hesitated. "For what reason?" Briggs stepped closer, his smirk fading. "Are you resisting?" Renee held her ground. "No, I'm asking a question." Something flickered across his face. Annoyance, amusement, or maybe both. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio. "We got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered into the speaker before raising his voice. "Turn around." Her pulse quickened, but her expression remained neutral. "Officer, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice low but firm. "I know exactly what my rights are, and I know exactly what you can't do." Briggs didn't like that. His jaw tensed. "You're under arrest," he snapped, reaching for her wrist. Renee moved just in time, stepping back to avoid his grasp. "Under arrest for what?" Briggs pulled out his cuffs. obstructing an officer. She exhaled sharply through her nose. So that was his game. Her military training took over. Steady heartbeat. Controlled breathing. She had two options: comply and fight this later, or push back and risk escalation. She refused to become another statistic. With slow, deliberate movements, she turned and placed her hands on the roof of her car. The metal was cool against her palms. Briggs wasted no time. He yanked her arms behind her back, clamping the cuffs on far too tightly before shoving her toward his patrol car. "You have no idea what you're doing," she murmured. Briggs chuckled, pushing her into the back seat. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't, not even close. The hard plastic seat pressed uncomfortably into her back. Renee sat motionless, the cuffs digging into her wrists. Her breathing remained steady as the door slammed shut behind her, locking her inside. Outside, Briggs strutted back to his vehicle, muttering something into his radio. She glanced at the partition separating her from the front seat, catching the faint reflection of her own face. Calm, composed, but underneath, something simmered. She had been through combat drills, high-stakes operations, and interrogations in foreign territories. But this was different. This was a man with a badge, drunk on authority, convinced he was untouchable. Minutes passed, then 5, then 10. She shifted her hand slightly, testing the cuffs, too tight. He had done it on purpose. The driver's side door swung open and Briggs slid in, whistling. "Well, well," he muttered, pulling his seatbelt across his chest. "Let's take a little ride." She didn't respond. He threw the car into gear, pulling off the shoulder, and back onto the road. The patrol car lurched forward, overhead lights still flashing. Through the side mirror, she saw red and blue reflections staining the pavement behind them. "You know," Briggs said after a moment, "most people just keep their mouth shut when I tell them to step out." Renee exhaled sharply through her nose. "And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop." Briggs chuckled, shaking his head. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody." She met his gaze through the glass. "I don't think, I know." That made him pause for a split second. His grip on the wheel tightened, irritation flickering across his face before he quickly masked it. "You military?" he asked, his tone shifting. She stayed silent. "Yeah, I figured," he continued. "You got that attitude, that above-the-law type." He smirked. "Bet you thought I'd back off if you threw that around." Still, she said nothing. Briggs clicked his tongue. "Shame," he mused, shaking his head. "If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this." Her jaw tightened. The audacity, the way he framed his own actions as her fault. Up ahead, the station came into view, a squat gray brick building just off the main road. The parking lot was nearly empty. Late-night processing was slow, and for now, it seemed she was the only one being brought in. Briggs pulled into a reserved spot near the entrance, shut off the engine, and turned toward her through the partition. "Gotta say," he murmured, "I do love when they make it easy." Before she could respond, he was out of the car, slamming the door behind him. A second later, her door swung open. "Let's go," he ordered. Renee twisted her wrist slightly as she stepped out. The cuffs bit into her skin. He hadn't loosened them at all. She held her head high as he led her inside, past a bored-looking desk sergeant and into processing. The holding area smelled of stale coffee and sweat. A metal bench lined the far wall, and a steel door led to the cells beyond. Briggs uncuffed her just long enough to push her through booking. Fingerprints, mugshot, the whole routine. The officers behind the desk barely looked up, just going through the motions. She had seen this kind of indifference before, the kind that let men like Briggs thrive. Once it was over, he grabbed her wrist again, leading her toward the cells. You think you're smart, huh? He muttered under his breath. She glanced at him sideways. I don't have to think. His grip tightened. That got to him. Enjoy your stay, Briggs sneered, shoving her toward the cell. Renee caught herself before she stumbled. She turned back, watching as the metal bars slid shut between them. Briggs smirked from the other side, tapping the bars lightly with his fingers before walking away. The lock clicked into place. She took a slow breath and sank onto the bench. The cold metal pressed through her jeans, grounding her. One night. That's all it would take. Because Briggs had no idea who he had just messed with. The bench was hard, unyielding. Renee shifted slightly, rolling her shoulders to ease the stiffness setting in. The cell wasn't much. Just 4 walls, a single flickering light, and the lingering scent of sweat and disinfectant. She had spent nights in far worse conditions, in places where the threat wasn't just discomfort, but real danger. This was nothing, but that didn't mean she wasn't angry. Through the bars, she heard the faint murmur of officers talking at the front desk, the occasional shuffle of paperwork, the clatter of a coffee cup against a table. She exhaled, slow, steady. Control the breathing, control the mind. Basic training had drilled that into her long before she ever set foot in the fleet. Then, heavy footsteps. Briggs. She knew it was him before he even appeared. His stride had that same arrogant rhythm, the walk of a man who thought he was untouchable. Briggs appeared in front of the cell a moment later, arms crossed over his chest, that same smug grin stretched across his face. Comfy? Renee didn't answer. He tilted his head, stepping closer to the bars. You know, if you'd just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now. A slow smile curled at the edges of her lips. Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be. Briggs's smirk faltered for just a second, a flicker of something in his eyes. Annoyance, uncertainty. He masked it quickly, scoffing as he glanced toward the empty holding area. No one's coming to get you tonight, lady, he shrugged. Guess that means you'll have some time to think about that attitude. Renee just watched him, unmoved, unshaken. Briggs leaned in slightly. See, here's the thing, he continued, lowering his voice. People like you think the rules don't apply. You think a little confidence is enough to get out of trouble. She let him talk, let him ramble. It didn't matter, because he had no idea what was coming. And then, as if on cue, another officer approached from the hallway. A younger guy, probably late 20s, dressed in a standard-issue uniform. He stopped a few feet away, gripping a clipboard. Sergeant? The officer's voice carried a hint of unease. We got a call. Briggs barely spared him a glance. The officer hesitated, shifting on his feet. And I think you need to see this. Briggs frowned, throwing Renee one last look before stepping away. She leaned back, listening. The conversation was hushed, but she caught pieces of it. Something about a lawyer, a call from higher up, questions about why she was being held. Briggs's voice dropped, sharp and irritated. The younger officer stammered a response, but whatever he said didn't seem to improve Briggs's mood. Then, heavy footsteps. Briggs stormed back, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides. His smirk was gone. What the hell did you do? Renee leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. I didn't do anything. She tilted her head slightly. But people talk. And some of us have friends in very high places. Briggs's face darkened. She saw it then, that moment of realization, the shift in power. He wasn't in control anymore. He turned on his heel, muttering under his breath, and disappeared down the hallway. Renee exhaled. It wouldn't be long now. And when the truth came out, Briggs was going to regret every single decision that led him here. Morning light streamed through the narrow windows of the courthouse, casting long streaks across the polished floors. The air inside was crisp, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones if you sat still too long. Renee stood near the defendant's table, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp. No cuffs, no orange jumpsuit, no holding cell. Just a well-tailored navy blue blazer, a simple blouse, and an undeniable presence. She wasn't alone. Beside her, her attorney, Carla Whitman, flipped through a stack of papers, barely looking up as people trickled into the courtroom. The woman was efficient, methodical, no wasted movements, no small talk. Renee liked that. At the back of the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors swung open. Briggs walked in. He still carried himself like he owned the room, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted. But there was a difference now, a stiffness in his step, a flicker of something in his expression that hadn't been there before. He wasn't as sure of himself anymore. Renee caught his eye. He looked away. Good. The judge entered, and the room quieted. Judge Alan Kirkland, an older man with a weary expression, adjusted his glasses as he settled in. He didn't waste time. "All right," he sighed, glancing over the case files. "Let's get to it." The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, new information suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Briggs." A murmur rippled through the room. Briggs shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. The judge peered at him over his glasses. "Sergeant Briggs, care to explain?" Briggs leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop." The prosecutor cut him off. "Uncooperative?" He lifted a document from the table. Lieutenant Commander Dawson's record shows a distinguished military career, graduate of the Naval Academy, multiple commendations, no criminal history, no outstanding citations. And you're telling me that despite all this, she was such a threat that you had to arrest her over a broken taillight? Briggs opened his mouth, then shut it. The silence stretched, the prosecutor continued, flipping through his papers. "Additionally, an internal review of your arrest history shows a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Briggs's face darkened. Judge Kirkland set his file down with a sigh. "Sergeant, I don't like what I'm hearing." Briggs sat back, crossing his arms. "She resisted." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "The body cam footage says otherwise." Another ripple of noise moved through the room. Briggs looked at the judge, his posture suddenly more defensive. "I was following standard procedure." Judge Kirkland wasn't convinced. He glanced toward the bailiff. "Let's play the footage." A screen lowered at the front of the courtroom, and the video began to play. Renee didn't turn to watch. She didn't need to. She had lived it. Briggs barking orders, her calm voice, the unnecessary escalation, the smug way he tightened the cuffs. The room was dead silent when the footage ended. Judge Kirkland leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Sergeant Briggs, you violated protocol, conducted an unlawful arrest, and failed to report the full details in your initial statement." Briggs opened his mouth, but the judge wasn't finished. "The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are hereby dismissed." His gavel came down, sharp, final. "And I strongly suggest an internal investigation into Sergeant Briggs's conduct." The tension in the room snapped like a stretched rubber band. Briggs looked like he had been punched in the gut. His face flushed red, hands clenched into fists at his sides. Renee simply exhaled, slow, controlled. She had never doubted this outcome, As she stood collecting her things, she glanced toward Briggs one last time. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. They didn't need to be. Because, this time, she wasn't the one fighting for her reputation. Briggs was. He stormed out of the courtroom, his heavy footsteps echoing down the polished hallways. His face was tight, his jaw clenched. He could feel the eyes on him. Other officers, court staff, even reporters who had shown up after word of the case spread. He wasn't used to this. He was used to control, to walking into a room and commanding respect, or fear. But now, the power he had taken for granted felt like it was slipping through his fingers. And then came the worst part. "Sergeant Briggs." A sharp voice cut through the hallway. He turned. Chief Eldon Baker stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The older man had been on the force for over 30 years, a respected figure. His word carried weight. Briggs straightened. "Sir." Baker studied him for a long moment. Then, with a curt nod, he motioned for Briggs to follow him into a private office. The second the door shut, the chief's tone dropped. "What the hell were you thinking?" Briggs exhaled sharply. "I was doing my job." "Your job?" Baker scoffed, tossing a file onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. "That's not what it looks like from here. The body cam footage, the arrest history." His voice sharpened. "The fact that you didn't even know who you were arresting." Briggs's nostrils flared. "What does that have to do with anything?" Baker leaned forward. "Everything." His voice was quiet but razor-sharp. "This wasn't some random woman. This was a high-ranking Navy officer. You think this is just going to disappear?" Briggs looked away, grinding his teeth. "She was disrespectful. She questioned you," Baker cut in. "That's not a crime." Briggs scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't get it. People like that—" Baker's expression hardened. "People like what?" Silence. Briggs swallowed but said nothing. Baker sighed, rubbing his forehead. "The DA is reviewing every single one of your cases from the past 5 years. You've been flagged for racial profiling, and you better believe this department isn't going down with you." Briggs felt his stomach twist. "What does that mean?" Baker straightened. "It means you're being put on immediate suspension, effective now. Internal Affairs is investigating. And if they find what I think they're going to find—" He shook his head. "Your career is over." The words hit Briggs like a punch to the gut. His face burned. "This is bull—" Baker held up a hand. "Don't finish that sentence." His voice was ice. "Pack up your desk, and if I were you, I'd get a lawyer." Briggs stood there, fists clenched at his sides. His world was unraveling in real time, and for the first time in his career he realized he wasn't untouchable. Across town, Renee sat in a quiet cafe, stirring her coffee as she scrolled through her phone. The case had already made headlines. The footage had gone viral. Lieutenant Commander wrongfully arrested. Officer under investigation. She wasn't surprised. From the moment she had stepped out of her car that night, she had known exactly how this would play out. She had seen men like Briggs before, entitled, arrogant, accustomed to bending the law in their favor, but this time he had lost. Her phone buzzed. A message from her attorney. "Briggs has been suspended. Might face charges." Renee took a slow sip of her coffee. "Good." She glanced out the window, watching the city move on around her. The fight wasn't over. Not for her, not for the people Briggs had likely harmed before. But today was a win. The crisp afternoon air carried the scent of fresh rain as Renee stepped out of the cafe. The weight of the past 24 hours should have lingered on her shoulders. But it didn't. She walked with the same confidence she always had. Head high, steps steady. Her phone buzzed again. This time she recognized the number. She sighed, then answered. "Captain?" "Lieutenant Commander?" the familiar voice greeted her. "I assume you've seen the news?" "I have." A brief silence. Then, "And how are you feeling?" Renee glanced at her reflection in a nearby storefront window. No signs of defeat. No cracks in her composure. "I feel like I did exactly what I was supposed to do," she replied. The captain's voice softened. "That's what I thought you'd say." A pause. "The Department of Defense has taken interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it." Renee exhaled through her nose. She wasn't eager to become a headline. "You already are," the captain countered. "And whether you like it or not, what happened to you is a reflection of something bigger." She knew that. She had always known that. Briggs wasn't just one bad officer. He was part of a system that had allowed men like him to operate unchecked for years. This wasn't just about her. It was about the dozens, maybe even hundreds of people who had been in her shoes, but didn't have the rank, the legal team, or the voice to fight back. Renee leaned against a streetlight, watching the traffic pass by. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," she said. "And it won't be the last." "No," the captain agreed. "But it's the first time Briggs is facing consequences. And that's because you didn't back down." Renee closed her eyes for a second, letting those words settle. She hadn't backed down. Not when Briggs pulled her over. Not when he tried to intimidate her. Not when the cuffs tightened around her wrists. Not even when she spent the night behind bars, knowing full well the odds were stacked against her. She had stood firm. And now, she had won. The captain cleared his throat. "One last thing," he added. "You might be getting a call from the mayor's office." Renee's eyebrows lifted. "Oh?" "Seems they want to recognize you for handling the situation with professionalism and grace." She smirked. "Well, that's ironic." The captain chuckled. "You gonna accept it?" Renee thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I'll think about it." She ended the call and slipped her phone back into her pocket. Across the street, a mother walked with her young son, his small hand wrapped tightly around hers. He was laughing about something, carefree, full of life. Renee watched them for a moment. The next generation. She had fought for herself, yes, but she had also fought for him. For every black boy and girl who deserved to grow up in a world where men like Briggs couldn't wield their badges like weapons. She took a deep breath. And then she walked away, her steps firm, her purpose clear. Because this fight wasn't just hers. It never had been. Power unchecked is power abused. And the only way to change the system is to hold it accountable. What happened to Renee happens to people every day. People who don't have the privilege of rank, connections, or undeniable evidence on their side. That's why it's important to speak up, to demand change, to refuse to stay silent. If this story made you think, share it. If it made you angry, talk about it. And if it made you realize how much work is left to do, stay engaged. Because real change starts with real conversations.